Greetings, everybody, and welcome to this live stream, which looks at one of the most crucial events in recent history. Recent history I'm counting as being the last 50 years or so, and one of the least understood. Just Googling about the events of August 19th, 1991 reveals a series of fantasies on behalf of Western commentators. The biggest of which is that those who carried out the events of 1991 were communist hardliners. And in this episode, I hope to demonstrate that that was very much not the case. So, what was the event to which this episode title refers to? It's referred to as a coup in the West. But what the event should be more properly called the temporary attempt by a group of 8 senior politicians from the Soviet Union to, nominally take power from Mikhail Gorbachov, and to create a temporary emergency government that was reported to have wanted to govern for 6 months. Its formal name was the State Committee on the State of Emergency, which is abbreviated to the Russian acronym GKCHP. I think in Russian it's GKCHP. I'm probably mangling that. So this was a temporary contested government which existed for exactly, around about 3 days, from the 19th to the 21st of August 1991. Described, as I said, in the West as an attempt by so-called communist hardliners to seize power and prevent a wonderful transition to democracy. What it in reality was something that was very different. It certainly wasn't the work of any communist hardliners, given that all 8 of the men associated with this had been allied with Gorbachev for years, and some of which had been very closely allied to him. So in the next 90 minutes or so, we're going to go through all of this. So to outline who we're talking about, the State Committee on the State of Emergency consisted of 8 men. I will argue that they're following Roger Kieran and Thomas Kenny's thesis, that there was actually a 9th man involved in this as well, but he will remain nameless until later in the program. I'll leave you to work out who it was. But the 8 men who put their names to this were Gennady Yanayev, the vice president at that time of the Soviet Union, Valentin Pavlov, the prime minister, Vladimir Kryuchkov, head of the KGB, Dmitry Yazov, minister of defense, Boris Pugo, minister of interior, Vasily Starodubtsev, chairman of the Soviet Peasants' Union, and Alexander Tizyakov, president of the Association of the State Enterprises and Objects of Industry. Rather wordy title for the last guy there. There was these 8 men who appeared before the media on the 19th of August, 1991, and announced that they were taking power. Now I'm going to read to you from 2 things now, which was their appeal to the Soviet people and their first order, which was one of very few orders they actually issued. But they made the following appeal to the Soviet people, which I will now read to you in full. Compatriots, citizens of the Soviet Union, in this difficult, critical hour for the fate of the fatherland and our peoples, we appeal to you. A mortal danger hangs over our great motherland. The policy of reforms, initiated by Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, conceived as a means of ensuring the dynamic development of the country and the democratization of public life, has reached a dead end due to a number of reasons. The initial enthusiasm and hopes have been replaced by disbelief, apathy, and despair. The authorities at all levels have lost the trust of the population. Politicking has ousted concern for the fate of the fatherland and the citizen from public life. Malicious mockery of all state institutions is being instilled. The country has essentially become ungovernable. Taking advantage of the freedoms granted, trampling on the newly emerging shoots of democracy, extremist forces have emerged that have taken a course toward the liquidation of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the state, and the seizure of power at any cost. The results of the nationwide referendum on the unity of the fatherland have been trampled. Cynical speculation on national feelings is only a screen for satisfying ambitions. Neither the current troubles of their peoples nor their future worries political adventurers. Creating an atmosphere of moral and political terror and trying to hide behind the shield of public trust, they forget that the ties they condemn and tear apart were established on the basis of much broader public support, which moreover has passed the centuries-long test of history. Today, those who in essence are leading the matter to the overthrow of the constitutional order must answer to their mothers and fathers for the deaths of many hundreds of victims of inter-ethnic conflicts. On their conscience are the crippled destinies of more than 500,000 refugees. Because of them, tens of millions of Soviet people who yesterday lived in a single family and today find themselves outcasts in their own homes, have lost their peace and joy in life. What the social system should be, the people must decide, but they are trying to deprive them of this right. Instead of caring for the safety and well-being of each citizen and the whole society, people who have power in their hands often use it in interests alien to the people, as a means of unprincipled self-affirmation. Streams of words, mountains of statements and promises only emphasize the meagerness and wretchedness of practical deeds. Inflation of power, more terrible than any other, destroys our state and society. Every citizen feels growing uncertainty about tomorrow, deep anxiety for the future of their children. The crisis of power has had a catastrophic effect on the economy. The chaotic, spontaneous slide towards the market has caused an explosion of egoism, regional, departmental, group and personal. The war of laws and the encouragement of centrifugal tendencies have resulted in the destruction of the unified national economic mechanism that had been in place for decades. The result has been a sharp decline in the standard of living of the overwhelming majority of the Soviet people, the flourishing of speculation and the shadow economy. It is high time to tell the people the truth. If urgent measures are not taken to stabilize the economy, then in the very near future, famine and a new round of impoverishment are inevitable, from which there is only one step to mass manifestations of spontaneous discontent with devastating consequences. Only irresponsible people can rely on some kind of help from abroad. No handouts will solve our problems. Salvation is in our own hands. The time has come to measure the authority of each person or organization by a real contribution to the restoration and development of the national economy. For many years we have been hearing incantations from all sides about commitment to the interests of the individual, care for his rights, social security. In reality, man has been humiliated, deprived of real rights and opportunities, and driven to despair. All democratic institutions created by the expression of the people's will are losing weight and authority before our eyes. This is the result of the targeted actions of those who, grossly trampling on the basic law of the USSR, are actually committing an unconstitutional coup and are striving for unbridled personal dictatorship. Prefectures, mayors' offices and other illegal structures are increasingly replacing the Soviets elected by the people without prior arrangement. There is an attack on the rights of workers. The rights to work, education, healthcare, housing and recreation are being called into question. Even basic personal safety is increasingly under threat. Crime is growing rapidly, becoming organized and politicized. The country is sinking into the abyss of violence and lawlessness. Never in the history of the country has the propaganda of sex and violence threatening the lives and health of future generations reached such a scale. Millions of people demand that measures be taken against the octopus of crime and blatant immorality. The deepening destabilization of the political and economic situation in the Soviet Union is undermining our positions in the world. Here and there, revanchist notes have been heard. Demands are being made to revise borders. There are even voices about dismembering the Soviet Union and about the possibility of establishing international trusteeship over individual objects and regions of the country. This is the bitter reality. Only yesterday, a Soviet person who found himself abroad felt like a citizen of an influential and respected state. Nowadays, he is often a second-class foreigner, treated with contempt or sympathy. The pride and honour of the Soviet people must be restored in full. The State Committee for the State of Emergency in the USSR is fully aware of the depth of the crisis that has struck the country. It assumes responsibility for the fate of the motherland and is determined to take the most serious measures to quickly bring the state and society out of the crisis. We promise to hold a broad nationwide discussion of the draft of the new Union Treaty. Everyone will have the right and opportunity to calmly comprehend this most important act and make a decision on it, because the fate of the numerous peoples of our great motherland will depend on what the Union will become. We intend to immediately restore law and order, put an end to bloodshed, declare a merciless war on the criminal world, eradicate shameful phenomena that discredit our society and humiliate Soviet citizens. We will clear the streets of our cities of criminal elements, put an end to the tyranny of plunderers of the people's property. We advocate truly democratic processes, a consistent policy of reforms leading to the renewal of our motherland, to its economic and social prosperity, which will allow it to take a worthy place in the world community of nations. The country's development should not be built on a decline in the standard of living of the population. In a healthy society, a constant increase in the well-being of all citizens will become the norm. Without weakening our concern for strengthening and protecting the rights of the individual, we will focus on protecting the interests of the broadest strata of the population, those who have been hit hardest by inflation, disorganization of production, corruption and crime. While developing the multi-structured nature of the national economy, we will also support private enterprise, providing it with the necessary opportunities for developing production and the service sector. Our primary concern will be to resolve food and housing problems. All available forces will be mobilized to meet these most urgent needs of the people. We call on workers, peasants, the working intelligentsia, all Soviet people to restore labor discipline and order in the shortest possible time, to restore the level of production, and then decisively to move forward. Our lives and the future of our children and grandchildren, the fate of the fatherland, depend on this. We are a peace-loving country and will strictly observe all the obligations we have assumed. We have no claims against anyone. We want to live with everyone in peace and friendship. But we firmly declare that no one will ever be allowed to encroach on our sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity. Any attempts to speak to our country in the language of dictatorship, no matter who they come from, will be decisively suppressed. So I'll leave it there because it does go on for a little bit of time after that. But essentially, what they outline there is the situation that was in place in 1991. A lot of it, what they say there, is undoubtedly true. Unfortunately, these were the very last men to be able to who would be able to actually resolve some of these situations. So let's start with what they said there that was true. The country was indeed breaking apart. Baltic separatists, counter-revolutionaries had essentially got to the point of launching seizures of power in the Baltic states. Armenian reactionaries had done the same thing in Armenia. The similar situation arose in Georgia, and this had all taken place in the later 1980s, specifically after 1987. There'd also been ethnic riots against the Russian population in Kazakhstan. So these were problems which all erupted during Gorbachev's so-called perestroika, and the so-called economic reforms, which essentially destroyed the planned economy of the USSR. It had already been severely damaged by the Kosygin reforms and other pro-market reforms tried by Kosygin and others in the 60s and 70s. Now, in fact, you can trace it back earlier to Khrushchev's privatization of the formerly state-run tractor stations in the 1950s. So, as I have said many times before, Gorbachev did not create these situations. He created the processes by which the antagonisms and contradictions that had grown in Soviet society exploded in the worst possible way. So what Yanayev and the others there are talking about is true in terms of the eruption of social problems, but to say that that this was an eruption of just the last few years, that isn't true. So, for instance, they talk about the shadow economy in their declaration there. Now, that was something that had been in existence in the Soviet Union probably since the 50s, with the pro-capitalist reforms started by Khrushchev. Certainly since the middle to later 1960s, and it and it was openly acknowledged, even in the Soviet press, that the shadow economy was a negative factor that was draining resources out of the country in the 1970s and early 1980s. Now, what the shadow economy was corrupt managers of state factories, essentially using their production lines to do private work for the black market, selling goods in the black market, on the black market. And around this mechanism, a lot of corruption grew up within the state infrastructure, within the party itself, specifically within regional party leaderships were often implicated in corruption. I'm thinking particularly of party leaderships in some of the Central Asian countries. Our old friend, the former dictator of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, was associated with this, which is why he became the dictator of Kazakhstan for a long time. And the emergence of regional mafia clans was linked to this black market as well. So it had been there for a long time before Gorbachev popped up. What Gorbachev did with these privatization laws, which were disguised as laws on cooperatives, which was drawn up not just by him but by Rizkov, his longtime associate. What Gorbachev did was essentially give up all controls over this and encourage it to come out into the open, and removed the state's ability to restrict capital exiting the country. So what you got was these corrupt officials were able to then engage in an orgy of looting and the transfer of wealth out of the country into a lot of Swiss and Cypriot bank accounts. You want to know where your oligarchy came from? It was already growing inside the party and the state. So the committee, what they said there was true. The shadow economy was running rampant. It was destroying the real economy, and there were mafia clans emerging, and that the law and order had broken down. But this had been going on. It's been noticeable for a good few years, because essentially the Gorbachev had disarmed the state's ability to actually keep a lid on any of this, never mind suppress it. And also, Yanayev, Kryuchkov, and the others had all been going along with Gorbachev for years. Kryuchkov and others knew very well what was going on. I mean, Kryuchkov was head of the KGB. He knew the state of play with regard to the mafia operations in the country. And these men had gone along with the systematic disarming and dismantling of first the party and the state. Now, as an article that was recently written in Gazeta Pravda points out, the moment when something really should have been done about Gorbachev and co. was earlier, when they did away with Article 6 of the former Soviet Constitution, where Article 6, which identifies the Communist Party of the Soviet Union as the party which is the state-building party, the party that represents the whole people, as the wording put it at the time, and the party which is building socialism in the Soviet Union. You can say, quite rightly, that it hadn't been doing that, or it had been deeply flawed and rotted from revisionism for a long time. But the fact was that even with all the problems that the CPSU had, it was still a party that had a mass working class base to it, and it still put up a lot of objections to the restoration of capitalism and got in the way of the the Gorbachev-Yeltsin clique, as it was. And it is for this reason that Gorbachev, and in alliance with the Yeltsin clique and various others, decided that they absolutely had to do away with the CPSU, to push it out of the way, to stop it being able to object and to block Gorbachev's pro-capitalist counter-revolution, which is why they did away with Article 6 of the Soviet Constitution. It's why they did that ridiculous counter-revolutionary counter-reform with the changing of the Constitution and the abolition of the CPSU's monopoly on power. It was designed to essentially empower the pro-capitalist forces and to push the working class finally out of power. This, again, was a 30-year process which had been going on since the 50s. And because the party kept objecting and trying to block some of the pro-capitalist moves made by Gorbachev, the Democrats, i.e. the pro-capitalist faction, decided that the party had to be pushed out of the way. Now, in the first bourgeois elections in the Soviet Union in the later 1980s, after they formally did away with the party's leading role in the country, the CPSU still won the majority in the Congress of People's Deputies, as it was called, and had the majority in the Supreme Soviet. Now, as the statement from the committee from 1991 points out, what was being done in particularly Russia, but also places like Georgia and the Central Asian states, was that even the new Gorbachev constitution of 88 was being overridden by various local cliques who were installing the mayor's offices and various institutions copied directly from the West and declaring that they were the ones that now held power, not the Soviets. You see, formally, under the constitution of the USSR, it was still the Soviets, from the local Soviets all the way through to the Supreme Soviets, the Supreme Soviets of the USSR, that formally were the sources of all political power in the USSR. Now, corroded some of this may have been, but it still provided a much more democratic expression of working class power, a much more thorough expression of working class power than, well, any bourgeois democracy, even with all its flaws. And this is the key reason why both Gorbachev and the Yeltsin clique were united in wanting to attack and undermine the power of the Soviets. And Yeltsin finally succeeded in doing that in Russia in 1993 with the events that are known as Black October. But it suffice to say that all of the pressure on the Soviet Union externally from the imperialists and all the pressure internally from the counter-revolutionaries was dedicated towards two principal aims in the 80s. Pushing the Communist Party out of its position as being the leading guiding force in the Soviet Union, and again a coup against the system of Soviets and the installation of bourgeois institutions over and above these to overrule them. Now, of course the planners of the state committee, the emergency committee, make reference to that. But they also, because these men are deeply implicated in the Gorbachev era themselves, say, oh, we want to... you notice how many times they mention about individual rights in that? This is how far that the Gorbachev period, so-called perestroika, so-called glasnost, had gone in terms of undermining Soviet democracy already. See, what they are trying to square there is square an impossible circle. Is that they're trying to balance the Soviet system, which is an expression of working class democracy, proletarian democracy, no matter how flawed it might have gotten in the later 60s, 70s, and 80s, with a bourgeois system, with thoroughly bourgeois conceptions of individual liberty. And you can't square that circle. And it proved to be the case that these men were too compromised by their associations with the Gorbachev era to actually act. So whereas they say a lot of things in that statement which are true, and they they certainly, if they'd have succeeded in eliminating the problems facing the country, then or the immediate problems they identify, such as organized crime, separatism, and corruption, then that would have been more progressive than what happened. But these men were incapable of carrying through what was needed there. So we're going to pause now and just take a step backwards. The reasons for the events of August 1991 are myriad. One of them, though, relates to the earlier event in 1991, the March 1991 referendum on the continuation of the Union. Now, as we've mentioned many times, over 70% of the population of Russia, Ukraine, the Central Asian states, and Azerbaijan all voted to retain their position in the Soviet Union under a new Union treaty. And that was even true of Ukraine, where 75% of the population voted to stay in the USSR. Even Western Ukraine voted more narrowly in favor of staying in the USSR. The biggest areas which voted no in all of this were minorities inside Lvov, which heavily voted no, inside certain areas of Kiev. But the biggest secessionist areas that voted in March 1991 were actually Russian. Particularly the no voters were concentrated in the RSFSR, in places like Leningrad and Moscow. The tragic thing about Leningrad, of course, is it goes from being the center of the revolution for a long time, a heroic city that the proletariat of which resisted the Nazi invaders for many years in the Great Patriotic War, to being one of the centers of counter-revolution. Now, it must be said that, of course, there were still many hundreds of thousands of workers in both Moscow and Leningrad who continually demonstrated all the way through 1990 and 1991 in favor of retaining the USSR. But it must be stated that the biggest support bases for Yeltsin were in places like Leningrad and Moscow. Around the rest of the country, Yeltsin and the pro-capitalist comprador clique he represented were nowhere near as popular as they were there. Now, Yeltsin won the election in 1990 to become, chair of the Russian Supreme Soviet, and translated that into a presidency, basically. Principally, it is argued by the KPRF to this day, because of the situation with the economy. Now, Yeltsin was a skilled demagogue, though I don't think he wrote his own stuff. He was probably too drunk to. But whoever his handlers were, cleverly played a game with the Russian population, where every time something went wrong, as it often did with the pro-capitalist reforms of Gorbachev, Yeltsin would declare that the fault lay with the state bureaucrats, with the planned economy, with the Communist Party, with the KGB, with the state, with all of the sources of power that still remained in the Soviet state. Yeltsin declared that it was their fault that things were falling apart, and all of these things needed to be swept aside. So that was the propaganda of Yeltsin, and it was effective at getting him a certain following, though those who went along with him, even people like Alexander Rutskoy, was an ally of Yeltsin in the late 80s and early 90s, later turned on him in the Black October events in 1993, when they came to realize just exactly what the clique behind Yeltsin was actually planning to do. So now we need to sort of widen the lens a little bit further when we talk about, what happened with the state committee. So this, to take this in purely linear terms, they take power, they make this appeal to the Soviet people. They nominally take power into their hands. Gorbachev, in this time period, is in, I believe it was in a dacha in Crimea. and had declared himself to be unwell, though he declared himself to have back problems. He didn't seem to have that when he got off the plane coming back later on. Now, Yanayev and co. criticized Gorbachev, but say they don't want to do away with all of these so-called reforms, but they want to restore order in the country. Constitutionally speaking, if Gorbachev is too ill to continue, which he declared that he was unable to fulfill his duties due to illness. He declared that prior to this. Now, this is just slightly before the signing of a new union treaty, which would essentially have set the process in place for the full disintegration of the country anyway, which is part of the reason why the GKCHP acted in the way that it did. Now, they declare that they're going to take power, but they don't. And this is where we get into a lot of anomalies. They make this appeal to the population, but they make no attempt to mobilize the population. They declare that Gorbachev's basically screwed everything up, but they don't really attempt to do anything about Gorbachev. In fact, when the coup collapses, the State Committee collapses, because they keep deferring to Gorbachev. So Kryuchkov and others, they go down to Crimea to negotiate with him. So why are you negotiating with a man who, constitutionally speaking, you can make the argument that Yanayev was already president. So if you are carrying out this transfer of power to this new government, and you intend to govern for 6 months, and you're saying you need to emergency rule to restore order in the country because the previous occupant of the post of president has screwed up enormously and has led the country into a crisis, then why are you going down to Crimea to negotiate with him? Why not arrest him and throw him in jail? Why also did they never restrict the movements of Boris Yeltsin or Sobchak or any of the other leaders of the Comprador clique? Why allow them to roam around freely in Leningrad, making all kinds of statements, Leningrad and Moscow, making all kinds of statements, with the full support, of course, of the imperialist press? Why do that? If you're trying to restore order, then why were their moves towards restoring order so halting and hesitant? Why did they not immediately arrest the people who they say in their own statement were leading the country towards disaster? Now, it's very strange that, again, if this was what the Western academics and journalists claim that it was, which is the actions of communist hardliners, then why were not the separatist leaders in Russia, because that's what Yeltsin was by that stage, he was actively, as they say in the State Committee says in its statement, he's actively trying to destroy the constitution of the Soviet Union, to separate Russia from the Soviet Union and therefore destroy it, which is what Yeltsin wasn't making a secret of that. He was doing it out in the open. He was essentially issuing all of these decrees that were completely illegal under the RSFSR's own constitution. But he was getting away with it because no one was acting against him. So if your aim is to stop separatism, why not arrest the leaders of Russian separatism, who have been acting completely illegally in a lot of the things that they've been doing, who've been establishing extra-constitutional means of government, who've been undermining the rule of law openly and flagrantly doing it? Why do you allow them to go? Why do you allow Yeltsin to stand out in the open and make all kinds of demagogic statements? Why not arrest him? And here we come to the big issue here. Who's the ninth man I mentioned earlier in the coup? Well, the thesis put forward by Roger Kieran and Thomas Kenny in their book Socialism Betrayed, and it's a thesis I think is borne out by the actions of Yanayev and others, the ninth man in the coup was supposed to be Gorbachev. I'm convinced of that, and to address why that was, we need to take a little bit of a step back. See, Gorbachev and Yeltsin were rivals sometimes, but were working together or working alongside each other more often than they were not prior to about 1989 to 90. They were in agreement on removing the CPSU from its place in power. They were in agreement on essentially dissolving the remaining elements of proletarian democracy and replacing it with bourgeois institutions. They were in agreement essentially on fracturing the Soviet Union as it had previously existed. Now, what they represented, though, were two allied but disparate forces. Yeltsin represented like the pure, absolutely naked Russian comprador bourgeois, the most corrupt, the most reactionary, the most out-and-out fascistic elements had all gone over to Yeltsin. He was their front man. He was the chosen puppet of imperialism, and so he became. So there are those who just wanted to completely destroy all elements, the remaining elements of socialism. And if that meant destroying the Soviet Union itself, then so be it, as long as they got to rule over a Russia that played the role that Russia did in the 90s, which is a subordinate, almost a semi-colony of US imperialism. That's what the people behind Yeltsin wanted. Gorbachev and others around him, because he's by no means acting alone, no one ever acts alone in these things. Gorbachev, again, he's pulled in different directions, but there's a group around him represented by shady figures such as Primakov, Yevgeny Primakov, who'd later be prime minister under Yeltsin, but also a rival to Yeltsin. What these people wanted was something a little bit different. They wanted to move over to a form of state capitalism, which would retain the Soviet Union, but would be a transitional regime over to capitalism. And this is kind of the direction that Gorbachev was going in. And this is the reason why he set up the office of president of the USSR, which hadn't existed before 1989. And of course, part of it was, of course, ego and pathetic imitations of things in the West. But what it was designed to do was to create a powerful office of the president in order that Gorbachev could push through pro-capitalist reforms without reference to the Supreme Soviet and without even reference to the Congress of People's Deputies, which Gorbachev himself had set up. See, what Gorbachev was doing was setting up this sort of what I would call a Caesarist regime that would carry through the counter-revolution in a more controlled way. So Gorbachev and Yeltsin are both working towards a pro-capitalist aim. The clique behind Gorbachev, largely, but not exclusively, it wanted to go in the direction of a more controlled form of state capitalism, which is, funnily enough, what's ended up happening under Putin. The Yeltsin clique just want outright destruction. Now, what's happening in 1991 is that the split between these two forces, let's call them an emergent sort of state-oriented, maybe more national bourgeois types broadly behind Gorbachev, and the out-and-out Russian comprador, Pinochet-esque fascist group around Yeltsin. And the Yeltsin clique is making a lot of moves to destroy the USSR, as the GKCHP make clear in their statement. Now, the reason why they acted, I think, was because they saw that Yeltsin was making all these moves, and they were going to end up basically with the country completely destroyed. Now, for some of them, it might have just been a case of attempted self-preservation. I think also, though, that the reason why I call Gorbachev the ninth man here was because he also realized that Yeltsin was going to do him out of a job. The problem was, though, that this committee for the emergencies, the emergency committee, was meant to then be led by Gorbachev. Now, one of the men who was involved in this, when they went down to see Gorbachev, said that they begged him to take full power. They begged him to come and lead the state committee that had just been set up. So how is it a coup if you're begging the man you've supposedly overthrown or were replacing due to illness to come and lead you? I think what was meant to happen was the Yanayev was meant to announce this this emergency committee. Gorbachev was then meant to step forward and say, well, I will lead it. There is an emergency. We need to get this out of the way. I will now lead us in this new direction. So why didn't he? Is the interesting question. Why did Gorbachev betray his own men? Interesting question. And it's not just myself or Kieran and Kenny who put forward these arguments. It's also people like Alexander Rutskoy. Now, Rutskoy was an ally of Yeltsin at this time, later turned against him, later temporary president in Black October 1993. Rutskoy, in an appearance that he made on the Soloviev television program, which is Soloviev's a sort of Kremlin propaganda clown, but occasionally useful discussions are had on his programs, or it's useful revelations are made. And Rutskoy, I think it must have been a few years ago now, because he's on there with Zhirinovsky, and Zhirinovsky's clowning like he always did. But Rutskoy, when he's asked about 1991, actually gets quite animated and quite angry. And he, because he was an Air Force officer, I think, Rutskoy, and he said, well, I flew to Crimea to pick up Gorbachev, thinking he was under arrest. And Rutskoy says to Soloviev, well, I went down there and I found that he wasn't under arrest at all. He was walking around a free man. So Rutskoy says this struck him as rather odd. And he said in his contribution to the Soloviev program, Rutskoy said, look, the plan was that they were going to restore the power of Gorbachev via the State Emergency Committee, and that they were going to do this in order to sandbag Yeltsin and sideline him. But because Gorbachev, for various reasons which I can only speculate about, essentially, like a coward, ran away from this committee that he'd helped to set up, Rutskoy put forward the argument that the State Emergency Committee had actually been operating since March, because it was responding to a series of emergencies in the country, which that statement points to. And so Gorbachev, who had been the man who had sponsored the careers of a lot of these men, like Yanayev was his own vice president. So Yanayev was in on the plan to turn the office of the president of the Soviet Union into this institution that would push forward the pro-capitalist reforms, but do it in a slightly different way to what the Yeltsin clique wanted. So these are all men who owed their careers to Gorbachev and to the perestroika process. These weren't hardliners. They're the actual men who had objected to Gorbachev's counter-revolutionary moves that had all been pushed out years before. Even people like Yegor Ligachev had been pushed out, who came through with Gorbachev originally. So these weren't hardliners. These were Gorbachev's allies. These were, as Rutskoy puts it, Gorbachev betrayed his own comrades by refusing to take part in a plot that he helped to cook up. Now, why didn't he join this in the end? There's a number of reasons why I think what happened or what didn't happen happened. Why didn't Gorbachev join it in the end, even though this is something which is clear from the actions of Yanayev and others that they weren't expecting to be essentially left with their dicks in the wind. He was meant to step forward and lead it. So why doesn't he? I think partially there would have been pressure from the imperialists, the US imperialists. I think they probably had means of contacting Gorbachev or passing messages to him, making it clear that if he did act like this, then it would not be responded to favorably. I think that might be part of it. I think also is the other thing about Gorbachev is, along with the fact that he was a counter-revolutionary scumbag in many respects, he's also a coward. Let's not mess around here. he's also a very cowardly man. By all accounts, was a maneuverer, a slime bag. He was, of course, he wasn't from the generation who'd fought in the Great Patriotic War. Not that somebody who went, it's not impossible that somebody who went through that couldn't become a counter-revolutionary. Many did. But this is a guy who's as a lawyer, a slime bag, who had sort of maneuvered his way into up to the top, who was in love with luxury and a Western lifestyle, who'd never really known sacrifice or real hardship in his life, not in the way that perhaps the previous generation of leaders, including people like Brezhnev, had done. And when faced with what would be needed to suppress Yeltsin, I think he looked at it and essentially his spine turned to jelly, because he came face to face with the realization that to do what that statement that they put out was saying that they needed to do, there would be massive repression needed of the or the comprador forces. You would needed to have done at least what the Chinese did in 1989, maybe more, to suppress them. Now, it could have been done, I would argue. The actual support for full-blown counter-revolution and the dissolution of the USSR in 1991 was very, very small, or relatively small. Like, you're looking like 20 to 25% of the population. And how many of those would have been prepared to actually take up arms? How many of those could they have overcome serious opposition from the loyal Soviet army units that still existed? Many of which were deployed or were ready to be deployed, including one with a certain Sergei Surovikin contained within it as a tank commander at the time, I believe he was. But faced with what would have been needed to have been done, Gorbachev ran a mile, didn't want anything to do with it, which is why the whole thing fell apart. Given that the man who was supposed to lead it ran away from it, this is why the whole thing fell to pieces. Now, could this then ever have succeeded? Let's assume for a moment that, let's take Gorbachev out of the picture, because one of the other reasons I think that he didn't lead it is because he was not a popular figure by 1991 in the Soviet Union. Everything he'd done had turned to shit for the working class. He was regarded as a traitor or a counter-revolutionary or a coward or a fool most of the time. He was being outmaneuvered by Yeltsin, because Yeltsin came across as a more forceful leader, and Yeltsin was certainly a forceful presence, particularly when drunk. But let's assume for a moment that Yanaev's words should be taken at face value and that they get rid of Gorbachev. They force him to resign. Could this have actually worked in terms of doing what they said they wanted to do? Well, possibly, but it would have been more bloody than the 1989 events in China. See, in 1989 in China, which came close to a full-blown counter-revolution, after being paralyzed for many days due to the presence in the General Secretaryship of the CPC of Zhao Jiang, who was very much the Chinese Gorbachev, who wanted to go for full-blown counter-revolution, the Politburo of the CPC was paralyzed during the events in Tiananmen Square for a number of days. Fortunately for the entire nation of China, the Politburo in the end made the correct decision, which is to suppress what had become a counter-revolutionary rising and to throw Zhao Jiang and the other Gorbachev types out of their positions in the hierarchy of the CPC and to place them under arrest, which is what eventually they did. Now, I credit that with their ability to act that way with the fact that there was still, despite the revisionism of the Chinese leadership, there were still a lot of strong communists in the CPC who were not prepared to see the progress made since the revolution of 1949 thrown away. And they weren't prepared to see an out-and-out counter-revolution triumph. So the party in China was a lot stronger and was able to throw out an out-and-out traitor in 1989. Now, much more difficult to do that in the Soviet Union in 1991, where the traitors have already won to a degree. But it would have been possible if in one of two ways. First of all, had the State Committee acted really decisively and very quickly, they could have disarmed the comprador elements very quickly. They knew where Yeltsin was, they knew where Sobchak was, they knew where all the key leaders of the comprador clique were. They could have sent loyal KGB troops in to secure them, have them put under arrest very, very quickly. They had all committed crimes against the Soviet system, and they had all committed grossly unconstitutional acts. So wrap them up and put them under arrest very quickly. But at the same time, you have to get ready for essentially the mobilization of counter-revolutionary demonstrations, which would have occurred. So the only way you can really deal with that effectively is if you get your people out into the streets earlier, which is where you need to be able to appeal to the Soviet working class across the entirety of the Soviet Union to come out and defend, at the very least, the results of the March 1991 referendum. And you need to appeal to the working class to mobilize in defense of that. They never did this. The Yanayev and the others never actually issued any instructions through the CPSU to mobilize the millions of loyal communists that still existed, that were still out there willing to fight to preserve the Soviet Union. They were never mobilized at all. The State Committee followed the counter-revolutionary changes to the Soviet Constitution, and they never attempted to mobilize the masses via the CPSU. They kept to the Gorbachov Constitution, and that they wanted to keep the masses and the masses that are contained within the CPSU demobilized and out of the picture. So you stand no chance of going against the counter-revolution if you're not prepared to mobilize those who had already been demonstrating in vast numbers in favor of keeping the country together. If you're not prepared to mobilize them, and if you're not prepared to use the state forces still loyal to the Soviet Constitution to arrest and dissolve the criminal conspiracy that Yeltsin was engaged in, and Sobchak and all the others, then really you're doing nothing. So I read another article in Gazeta Pravda from a communist who was in the Oryol region of what's now Russia, who said that when the events started, no instructions came from the Central Committee of the CPSU at all to the regions. Like, this was all largely fought out within Moscow and Leningrad. So given that you have a much better chance, if you want to preserve the Soviet Union, of doing so, if you actually mobilize the masses via the party, then if you're not going to do that, then you're fucked. You're waving around a gun with no bullets in it. And again, this comes back to the nature of the men who were leading this. They weren't leaders. They were looking to Gorbachev to lead them. Gorbachev wasn't a leader either. He'd already proved himself to be a pathetic reactionary tool of imperialism, which is what he ultimately turned out to be, who was incapable of even taking actions which, if Kieran and Kenny's thesis and if Rutskoy's account is correct, then he was in on that declaration on the need to restore order. He'd signed up to that, and I think it's the evidence presented by both Russian and the American sources I've cited is credible. He'd signed up to it, but he wasn't prepared to take any action to enforce it. They were never prepared to appeal to the masses. They wanted to proceed with their plan, which is to reinforce the power of Gorbachev's office of the Soviet president in order to restore capitalism that way. The last thing these people wanted to do was to mobilize the masses of the Soviet Union against the counter-revolution, because for all their words, they represented a counter-revolution almost as much as Yeltsin did. It was just a slightly more orderly version of a counter-revolution than that which the fascist clique behind Yeltsin were in favor of. So this was doomed from the very beginning. This was something that was meant to be led by a man who was a counter-revolutionary and a coward and a fraud in the form of Gorbachev, but he ducked out of it. It talked about restoring order, but it was and addressing the damaging consequences of what had been done since, by the way, the removal of the Communist Party from its position as the leading political power in the country in 1989. Since that, everything had disintegrated because the counter-revolution essentially broke and tried to destroy what remained of the power of the working class in the Soviet system. So these men who'd done that then turned around and tried to address it. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous to think that these guys could have led a restoration of Soviet power. They were opposed to Soviet power. They were actively dismantling it. What they wanted to do was to bolster the power of the office of the president against the Yeltsin clique, but they weren't prepared to even take any action which could have done that. These people were all cowards and frauds, and the victims of them, and Gorbachev, and the victims of Yeltsin numbered in the millions of people who paid the price for their failure, for their counter-revolution, for their cowardice, for their fraudulence. And what happened, again, even according to Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin himself in Russia in the 90s, was a form of a war. Because there was millions of casualties of this war. And it was a class war waged by a Russian capitalist class led at the time by a group of compradors, which waged a relentless war upon the Russian working class to stamp out and destroy all elements of working class power and to stamp out and to destroy all elements of the formerly existing socialist system. A move which began with Khrushchev but terminated with the dramatic 5 years, or 6 years almost, in power of Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. The end of the process, but by no means the originator of the process. So the August Coup was in reality no such thing. It was really a dispute between two different wings of a counter-revolution. And in that sense, it was something which, although the Yanayev and others said things which were objectively true, they were the very last people who would have been capable of doing anything about it, because they were as much tied up in the counter-revolution as Yeltsin himself was. This was just a dispute, not just, but it was a dispute between two pro-capitalist tendencies, one more openly vile and disgusting than the other ones, but both of whom were guilty of counter-revolution. And this leads me to a concluding point here. The Cultural Revolution in China gets denounced by many these days, including some who should know better. But there was a central point there which Mao and the so-called Gang of Four made over and over again, which is proven to be true in China and true in the Soviet Union, which is that the bourgeoisie is in the Communist Party. This was said by Mao and others in the late 60s and early 70s. This was true in Russia, in the Soviet Union as well. The bourgeoisie is in the Communist Party, and therefore the struggles that need to take place or needed to take place in the Soviet Union should have been ones that were directed by the masses at the headquarters, because it was in the senior positions, it was in the industrial management, it was in the senior positions in the party, it was in senior elements of the state and the military and the cultural sphere that the bourgeois forces grew back. And because after the death of Stalin, all of the leaders of the USSR, starting with Khrushchev, were dedicated to never mobilizing the masses for struggle, but demobilizing the masses, pushing the working class out of its position as the rulers of the country, replacing them with this wretched nomenclatura, which Che Guevara correctly observed had absurd privileges compared to what they had in Cuba or what they had in China at the time. And Che himself observed the dangers that would come from that. And every leader, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, all talked about restoring socialism, restoring Marxist-Leninism. All of them, though, were incapable of doing so, because you can't restore a healthy Leninist party regime, and you can't restore working class power by bureaucratic fiat, even if we assume that maybe some people in the Brezhnev era or the Andropov and Chernenko era actually did want to do so. You can't restore what had been lost by, again, bureaucratic and administrative fiat. The only way you can do that is by reviving the struggle of the masses, by reviving the struggle active struggle against reactionaries and counter-revolutionaries. And that is, of course, something that none of these people were prepared to do. So in each case, with each new leadership, the pro-capitalist elements, the bourgeoisie inside the party and the state, only got stronger to the point where they could mobilize many thousands in support of Yeltsin in 1991. Now, these numbers would have been dwarfed had the leaders of the State Committee been willing or able to mobilize the masses through the Communist Party. Had they done that, then it may well have been the case that because the counter-revolutionaries would have been intimidated again. And this point must be made. The problem in the Soviet Union was that there was no leadership for those who opposed Gorbachev. Gorbachev was General Secretary of the CPSU. It was his guys who, in the end, dominated the Politburo, dominated the hierarchy of the CPSU. He lost votes at the CPSU Congress on a number of occasions and even threatened to resign at various points. Was overruled by the Congress but refused to accept the verdicts. Carried on the way he was going anyway. So when the State Committee say that people like Yeltsin are, overruling the constitutional order, well, Gorbachev had already done that. Gorbachev did that all the time. He simply declared that any vote he lost was undemocratic. And so again, like these are not the people who were going to restore Soviet power, because these were the people who'd been dismantling it. Now, I should also say that the tendencies represented by both Gorbachev and Yeltsin had been there since the 1920s. You look at the plans of Bukharin, Rykov, and the right-wingers in the late 20s, early 30s. They look an awful lot like what Gorbachev was putting forward in the 1980s. So this tendency was always there in the Soviet Union, as Marx knew it was going to be, as Engels knew it was going to be, as Lenin knew that this was the case. Stalin understood it. Mao understood this. And this is why all of the great thinkers of Marxism, starting with Marx himself, stated that you would need to retain a dictatorship of the proletariat for 2 or more generations, while the struggle against the bourgeoisie inside the party intensifies after the revolution. Now, the leaders of the Soviet Union in the 1930s actually did understand this and waged successful struggles against both the Trotskyites on the left and the Bukharinists on the right, to the point where both were heavily defeated. Why? Because you actually had a healthier Leninist regime running inside the party at the time, where the party had very strong connections to the working class and increasingly the peasantry. And because of that, when the party was able to mobilize the masses in support of things like the mass industrialization, the 5-year plans, and collectivization, and against the Bukharinites and the Trotskyites. And later, because again the party leadership had a real connection with the masses of the Soviet Union, was able to effectively mobilize to destroy the Trotskyite and Bukharinite counter-revolutionary networks. And again, what happened in the 1980s is that because that link between the masses and the party hierarchy had been broken, first by Khrushchev, then all the others that followed on from him, is that you have a leadership which has essentially gone rogue, and the leadership itself had gone rotten. And so you have all these millions of workers in the Soviet Union, not just in Russia, but in all Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, all of whom were opposed to the breakup of their country and were looking for leadership, but there was none to be found. Because even those in the hierarchy who wanted to retain the Soviet Union had no conception as to what would have been needed in order to do that, which is essentially that you have to take more than one page out of the Maoist book, so to speak, and learn from the process of the Cultural Revolution, or learn from what had gone on in the 1930s. See, in the 1930s, because the leadership was strong and had a healthy Leninist regime in the party and had a strong connection with the masses, the attempts by the Trotskyites and the Bukharinites underground and the military conspiracies, all of which did exist and were real and were allied with fascist forces, these attempts were all suppressed and crushed. Again, though, the problem in the 80s was that no one ever stepped forward to lead. In fact, the leadership of the party were all in on the plot to restore capitalism, one way or another. They just differed as to how. And so, again, 1991 is just the sad end of an almost 40-year-long process that had gone on since the death of Stalin, of relentless counter-revolution, of the demobilization of the masses in the USSR, of the depoliticization of the masses in the USSR, of the separation of the leaders from the party, of the leaders starting to drift away into more and more pro-bourgeois positions, to the point where they'd, as you can see from that opening statement that I read out, they were very much on board with bourgeois perspectives on so-called individual rights. Very much pro-capitalist still, but they just wanted to be pro-capitalist in a slightly more orderly fashion, and Yeltsin and his squalid fascist clique wanted to. So what you are taught about the events in August 91 is really a fiction, as everything we're taught in the West about the Soviet Union, about history of the socialist countries, about the history of revolutions. Everything we're taught about all of these things in the West is basically a reactionary cartoon, as is the case with this. Right, I will now end my comments on that there and take comments from the floor. Tim Gray, good evening to you, who says, in answer to your question, yes, Gorbachov was in on it, but again, for the reasons I've explained, failed to carry through on his own promises. Littlestone, good evening to you. Abtin, hope you learned something from the broadcast this evening. Comradely greetings to Svetlana in Moscow. Grassy Knoll, good evening to you. Arnold joins us from a windy Bridlington. Hello to John Barleycorn, named after the old song. Sean joins us from a windy Plymouth. Almir joins us from the once and future Yugoslavia. Greetings to Jerry in Hampshire and T.G. Wilson. Svetlana says, it was a pity the coup did not work. It could have, were it not for the fact that Yanayev and Kryuchkov et al. Were not visionaries but careerists, worried that the new Union Treaty meant they'd be out of a job. Indeed. More time needed joins us from Skeggy, that's Skegness, UK. Good to have you with us. Roddy and Hugh, good evening to you. Svetlana says my pronunciation of Gakachepe is correct. Well, I have been back on the Russian lessons recently. Yepex says, did I see the DNC convention? I didn't see it. It was, I hear it was a real blast. But I'll come to that. I'll come to that on a stream pretty soon. HM, hello to you in Brighton. Oh yes, I did promise an RFK Jr. impersonation. So I should probably do that now to get this out of the way. Though I'm gonna do an American show tomorrow, so maybe I'll do more of it then. But when I saw a bit of RFK's completely hypocritical endorsement of Trump, I mean, Michael Tracy called it a scam, and I think on this he's right. RFK Jr. going up there going, Donald Trump is going to fight the deep state. I'm going to endorse Trump because he's just like JFK. I'm working on this, but I thought I'd make it sound like he was a sort of a vampire who had syphilis of the larynx. More work needed on it. More on this tomorrow. Greetings to Kent out in Minneapolis and to Comrade Ian Foster, Tom Jode, and Alan Smith, who says, greetings from Georgia. It took me a while to realize how narrative-driven anti-communism is. The idea of naive dreamers manipulated by cynical tyrants is a powerful story. It's literary, poetic, and false. Good point. Luca, greetings to you. David King, hello. Albert, who says, my sister wept when the USSR was dissolved. I would have done too if I'd have understood what was going on, but I understand your sister's impulses there. Truth be told, it was merely the last act in a long series of betrayals. Alan Smith says, if there was a plebiscite where it was voted to keep the Union intact and a small clique broke it up anyway, then even according to bourgeois standards, force was justified to stop it. Good point from Alan, but they never apply their standards to themselves. Svetlana says, Yanayev said in 92 that the documents for the GKCP were drawn up on Gorbachev's orders. There's a widespread theory in Russia that Gorbachev was in on the coup. Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think Yanayev and co. could tie their shoelaces without permission from somebody higher up the chain, and that person was Gorbachev. Krasovet says, the people in Bulgaria still voted for the socialists at the first democratic election. Obviously, the Western backed parties coalesced with far right to win following that. Yeah, the working class in a lot of the ex-socialist countries continued to vote for the reconstituted communist or socialist parties, but almost all of them proved incapable of actually delivering for the working class due to various factors, which there's not time enough to go into now. But yeah, the working class in all of these countries didn't actually want the end of the socialist system when actually you look at the opinions there. What we are presented with as revolutions were in actual fact counter-revolutions carried through by tiny minorities of these populations. There's arguments about the events in Poland being a mass counter-revolution, but I think there's more to be said there, and the story's still more complex. The leaders of Solidarność in Poland never told the truth about what they wanted to do. If you look back at their internal discussions, including those led by Wałęsa himself, they were all the talk was about maybe we're going to go towards Titoism, maybe we're going to go towards anarcho-syndicalism, maybe we're going to go towards some form of industrial democracy. It was all about how do we make socialism better, as Gorbachev's rhetoric was until about 1990, 91. It was they never said, a lot of these characters, that we're going to restore capitalism and basically asset strip and destroy the country, because they wouldn't have got any support if they had done. They had to lie about all of their intentions. Just as Yeltsin was always vague about what he was actually planning to do. He was very much all about the bombast, but never about the detail, because he didn't actually come up with the plans. They were just handed to him, maybe by people like Jeffrey Sachs. Almir says, in the late 80s, a short document started circulating in all the socialist governments in Eastern Europe describing how a new multi-party system should function. It was basically copy-pasted. It likely came from the CIA. Oh, yeah, the CIA was always putting out stuff like that. I mean, the imperialists worked non-stop for the destruction of all socialist governments. And again, like the most wretched thing about, well, one of the most wretched things about the revisionists in the Soviet Union was that they deliberately were failing to educate, or had failed to be educated on the nature of imperialism, which is that it doesn't matter how many concessions that you make, imperialism will still be hostile because it has no choice. It has to destroy any area of the world from which its exploitation is excluded. And the Soviet Union and the people's democracies were a huge block of the world in which they couldn't operate, in which they couldn't exploit. So of course they're going to work non-stop for its destruction. Of course they are. But if you had a healthy party regime, if you had the healthy connections between the party and the masses, if the masses were actually mobilized in the act of governing the state, as they were for a time in the Stalin period, then the machinations of imperialism won't have the same devastating impact as they later did. If you are a mobilized proletariat and peasantry unified together is like the most devastating weapon against imperialism you could ever possibly wield. And the fact that the leaders of the Soviet Union after Stalin deliberately demobilized and depoliticized the population is the reason why things ended up the way they did. Alex Oliveira says Gorbachev is remembered fondly in Germany for enabling unity. There is no hell low enough or painful enough for people like Gorbachev. Gorbachev should be remembered as a mass murderer, as should Yeltsin, because that's essentially what they are. What they did led to the mass murder in slow motion of millions of Soviet people, the displacing of millions more, the immiseration of hundreds of millions, and also the setback of progress towards socialism all the way around the world. There's no words strong enough to condemn Gorbachev and those who went along with, those who were his co-conspirators, such as Yakovlev, and even people like Ligachev, who ended up falling out with Gorbachev but went along with him, and the men involved in the GKCP. They were all guilty of the destruction of socialism. And you can even throw in Khrushchev and Brezhnev themselves. This is, by the way, a flaw of the modern KPRF. They rightly reject Gorbachev and all his works, but they criticize Khrushchev very heavily. But it seems to me that particularly in the form of like Zyuganov and the current leadership, they still have some of the weaknesses of the sort of Brezhnevite cadre, which is what a lot of them fundamentally are, especially Zyuganov, who takes the KPRF take a lot of positions that I think are correct, but I would still say that their understanding of how the counter-revolution in the USSR formed is still too centered on the individual figures of Khrushchev and Gorbachev. They don't take into account the conscious decision by the Soviet leadership to depoliticize and drive the masses out of the governance of the country, which is something that started under Khrushchev. They also echo the line that some of the 1991 committee men echoed, which is that they didn't want to have confrontations. It's a line that I've heard Zyuganov repeat on a number of occasions. It's a line that I've heard Putin say, oh, well, we can't have confrontations. We can't have conflict. Well, these lines are contradicted by other things that Zyuganov has said. Like Zyuganov has said, and said it before Putin, that the 90s were a war upon the Russian people. Not all of the Russian people. Of course, a tiny minority did very well out of it, but it's a war on the Russian working class. So you hear like Zyuganov say this quite a lot, that, well, the reason why we didn't act when Yeltsin and the imperialists blatantly rigged the 96 election was because, and Zyuganov said this in a recent documentary, that the people around Yeltsin wouldn't have hesitated to start a civil war. I mean, maybe he's right about that. There's no limit to what the compradors would do. There was no limit to what they did in 1918, 1920, 21, when they basically were ready to sell Russia to the British and the French and the American imperialists as long as they could get to run it. The comprador cliques who defected to the service of the Nazis in the 30s and the 40s were similar. Like the comprador elements, counter-revolutionary elements, are always prepared to reduce the country to ashes as long as they get to rule over the ashes. But where I find less easy to understand about Zyuganov's reasoning, and it's the reasoning of the KPRF leaders, is that if they say that there was a war waged on the Russian working class in the 90s, and it led to the premature death of millions, which it did, the displacement and the fleeing of the country of millions who went into exile, and the retardation of social progress back to over many so that progress retreated, the general standard of life collapsed. Well, that's a war on the people anyway. I mean, Zyuganov's argument is that the war in a civil war triggered by the comprador clique around Yeltsin in '96 would have meant the breakup of the country. Now, again, that's possible. It's certainly what the compradors were prepared to do in 1918 to 1921. Yeah, they were more than prepared to see the country broken up and destroyed. And I don't doubt that many of them would have done the same in the 90s. But the fact is that if that's what your opponent is prepared to do, and he's essentially threatening the forces of the Russian working class and saying that, look, if you don't let us continue with our looting of the country, we'll destroy the place. Well, then it points to a problem with the KPRF leadership that it couldn't respond. Like the problem with it points to a problem with the CPSU, which is even people like Zyuganov, who I believe very sincerely wanted to see the Soviet Union continue, who very sincerely did oppose its breakup and is sincerely opposed to the moves made by Khrushchev and Gorbachev. It's no good opposing something if you don't know how to actually stop them. And the only way these people could have been stopped is via mass mobilizations of the Russian working class, and as Stalin and the leaders did in the 1930s, active suppression of the counter-revolutionary cliques, meaning you arrest Yeltsin, you throw Gorbachev out of all his positions, as the Chinese did with Zhao Jiang, and you throw him in prison on the grounds of him being a counter-revolutionary traitor, which is what he was. No one was ever prepared to do that. And again, that points to a real problem with the CPSU, even amongst those in the leadership under Andropov and Chernenko, people like Vladimir Romanov, who I think was sincere in opposing what was done by Gorbachev, which is why Gorbachev forced him out. Again, they didn't know how to mobilize the masses in order to stop Gorbachev. Right. Germans love Gorbachev, says James Goblin. That's correct. Greetings to you in the once and future Yugoslavia. Almir says, it's scary how the CPSU and the Yugoslav communists degenerated in the 80s and became parties full of capitalists and nationalists. Wasn't just in the 80s, Almir. It was a 30-year process. You don't just see those people emerge overnight. They were always there in a minority position, but to see them come out with as much support as they got meant that they were allowed to. Svetlana says Gorbachev stole money given by West Germany to the USSR to reaccommodate Soviet soldiers from East Germany back in the Soviet Union. My father was one such soldier and suffered accordingly when he returned home. Gorbachev's a real fucking criminal scumbag. I mean, it's just, again, the fact that he got away with it and was able to die at an old age is very unjust. Svetlana says Khrushchev didn't fight in the war either. Very odd because he was born in 1924. Like Gorbachev, he was a bit of a wimp. Yeah, very suspicious that a guy who would have been 18 in 1942 would have been subject to call up. I wonder why he didn't fight. I mean, there's possibly legitimate reasons, but it's interesting where, I mean, Gorbachev was, I think, too young, but I mean, he must have done compulsory military service, but I imagine he found a way to weasel his way out of that as soon as possible. Krasavet says Andrei Lukhanov is a Bulgarian version of Gorbachev, total comprador. Yes. Dmitry Shanish says there's a very telling picture of Gorbachev with Raisa Gorbachev shopping in Vienna, happy with their shopping bags. I mean, just like the level of degeneration that like happened in the Soviet Union, to the point where you get like a guy who, I mean, I'm loath to quote Matt Taibbi, who's an anti-communist, but he did sum up Gorbachev quite well when he says that Gorbachev would have been prepared to give Hitler's corpse a blowjob as long as he got rewarded with a Brooks Brothers charge card. And that's true. Like I mean, there's the utterly pathetic and craven nature of Gorbachev was obvious very quickly. And again, he should have been removed by 87. He should have just been cut off, because it was clear by 87 what he was trying to do, and he should have been immediately removed from power and imprisoned. Just looking through the comments here. James Goblin says, speaking of shopping, there is also that famous video commercial of Yeltsin entering a supermarket with empty shelves with disbelief on his face. That fake was funded by the USA during his election campaign. Yeah, I mean, the empty shelves thing, I think, was real in certain areas of the country, but because of the chaos introduced into the system by Gorbachev's reforms. It wasn't because of the planned economy, it was because of the destruction of the planned economy. Again, fakes and frauds were perpetrated to take advantage of a situation which pro-capitalist reforms had created, to then turn the frustration at pro-capitalist reforms against the remaining elements of socialism. And again, all comes back to a failure of leadership. Nobody was able to step forward and actually put his foot down and chase out and suppress these characters, because again, everything had gone too rotten. And on Berlo says hedonism is not compatible with socialism or communism, and on Berlo is absolutely correct about that. I mean, trust me, had some run-ins with people today who very much gone down the hedonism road. Svetlana says Kryuchkov mobilized the Alpha Spetsnaz unit during the quote-unquote coup, but chickened out when it came to deploying them. Typical Kryuchkov move, big gesture but no action. Yeah. Again, if your aim is to restore order and stop separatism, then the biggest separatists are Yeltsin, Sobchak, and others. Why are you letting them roam around? Because again, they expected Gorbachev to step forward, and Gorbachev didn't. Rista Kostadinov says, didn't Brezhnev also promise to go back to Marxism-Leninism, and then he and Kosygin did more reforms, more pro-capitalist reforms? Yes, that's correct. Sid Hatfield says there was a long-running dispute amongst anti-Soviet Russians that went back to the NTS versus ABN days, Solidarność versus anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations. Interesting observation. Alex Oliveira says Gorbachev came to power by spreading fake news against his opponent, Grigory Romanov, at the time. It's Grigory Romanov, not Vladimir Romanov. Just scrolling through the comments here. What are my opinions on the DPRK? I believe it's a strong example of a still existing socialist country. And it doesn't have family rule, by the way. Yes, Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un have all occupied senior positions in the state. It's not family rule, though. It's not a family dictatorship. What you have there is an example of a still existing, much more healthy system where the masses are in the driving seat. The masses are mobilized in support of the system and in support and to struggle to continue their revolution. And and it is the role of the masses that is the most important in the ongoing Korean Revolution. Were it not for that, were it not for the close relationship, and in fact the inseparability of the Workers' Party of Korea from the masses in Korea, then the DPRK would have fallen apart. Had the leadership in the DPRK had been allowed to go as rotten as the Soviet leadership did, then the DPRK would have followed the Soviet Union into the pages of history. But it wasn't. And it's not just because of the role of Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-il, though their role as dedicated revolutionaries is important. It's because the DPRK consistently politicizes and mobilizes the masses. Now, admittedly, that's some of that through Juche, but again, I think Juche is merely an adaptation of Marxism-Leninism to the Korean circumstance. Dmitry Shanish says, in the 30s there are still people who paid bloody price and sacrifice to the revolution happened in the 80s. The gaining of the revolution was such a common thing that nobody felt like being prepared to defend them. I think people were, Dmitry. I mean, I think you come from the Soviet Union originally, I think you said before, but the problem was that, again, like the degeneration had gone on for a long time. Also, I think that too many people didn't thought that the system couldn't fall apart, and there was nobody who, I mean, that the party had degenerated to the point where nobody in senior or middle ranking positions could be regarded as a Marxist-Leninist anymore. Not really, and seriously, because none of them really understood the situation they were in. Even the ones who were sincere and wanted to stop the collapse didn't really understand the situation that they were in because they hadn't studied Marxism-Leninism properly. They'd become essentially social democrats, some more sincere than others. But again, the leadership had gone into a social democratic deviation from which it never returned. Theodoros Ibrahim is enjoying the presentation. Good to have you with us. Just scrolling through. Okay, so the RFK impression is going down well, it seemed. Dmitry Shanish says, do you think that Yeltsin bringing Putin to power can be considered as an act of regretting what his policies brought the country to? And he thought that Putin is the right person to fix some of the issues. No, I don't agree with that. I think Putin was a compromise candidate between various different groups in the Russian political system of the late 1990s. He was a compromise between the comprador elements and the national bourgeois elements, who had grown to hate each other. And Putin was the person who was decided upon as the one who was the most acceptable to all of the above. And it took him quite a while to establish himself as his own man to a degree. But he was always a compromise character. I don't think Yeltsin had a lot to do with it. I think Yeltsin's daughter and son-in-law did. And I think what they were most concerned about was that they would be allowed to essentially leave the country with their loot, or shall we say, stay in the country with their loot. Right. Okay. All right. Okay. I'm going to call for. I've noticed there's a lot more comments there, but I've got to draw things to a close for this evening. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be back answering questions on this tomorrow, and then I'll do also some stuff on the American election tomorrow. So join me again tomorrow, same time, same place, 7:30. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in tonight. Thanks to everybody who supports the program on Patreon. Wouldn't be able to do this without the support of all of you. So thanks to everybody on there. Thanks to everybody who supports the program via Buy Me a Coffee. I'll be back with you again tomorrow, 7:30. Come back for more RFK Jr. impressions. Good evening.